Have you ever had something so precious that you would do anything to protect it? That's how I felt when I first held my daughter in my arms. I never knew that a tiny human could make me feel so incredibly powerful and terrifyingly vulnerable all at once. Where are you watching from today? Comment down below. My journey to motherhood wasn't easy. 3 years of trying, 2 miscarriages, and countless nights crying myself to sleep. When the doctor finally placed my beautiful baby girl on my chest, time seemed to stand still. My husband James grabbed my hand, tears streaming down his face. We had agreed on her name months before, Aurelia Rose. Aurelia after my grandmother who raised me when my parents couldn't, and Rose for James's mother who had passed away just a year before our wedding. The name Aurelia means golden in Latin, and she truly was our golden ray of hope after years of darkness. It wasn't just a name to us. It was a tribute to the woman who taught me what unconditional love felt like, and a promise to our daughter that she would always be cherished. I remember how exhausted but exhilarated I felt those first few days in the hospital. The sleepless nights blended together as we learned to feed, change, and comfort our little one. James and I would take turns holding her while the other tried to catch a few minutes of sleep. In those quiet moments, with Aurelia's tiny hand wrapped around my finger, I felt complete in a way I never had before. Then came the day my mother-in-law Patricia arrived to help. Patricia had always been particular. She had definite opinions about everything from how to fold towels to what constituted an appropriate wedding dress. When we announced our pregnancy, she immediately started sending baby name books with little sticky notes marking her favorites. When we told her we had chosen Aurelia Rose, she went silent for a moment before saying, "Well, I suppose that's unique. But don't you think something more traditional would be better? Something people can actually pronounce?" I should have recognized that pause as the warning sign it was. At the hospital, Patricia insisted on holding Aurelia every chance she got. "My precious little grandbaby," she'd coo. "You're just too special for such a complicated name." I tried to ignore it. After all, we were all adjusting to this new family dynamic, and I was too exhausted to start any conflicts. When we brought Aurelia home, Patricia came to stay with us, just for a week or two, to help. Those weeks quickly turned into a month. Don't get me wrong, having an extra pair of hands was helpful. Patricia cooked meals, did laundry, and would take the baby when I needed a shower or a nap. But there was always this undercurrent of judgment. "You're feeding her again? Didn't you just feed her an hour ago? Should you really be holding her that way? Are you sure that crying means she's hungry?" In my day, we let babies cry a little to build their lung strength. And always, always there was the name issue. Aurelia is such a mouthful for a tiny baby. What about calling her Leah or Ellie, something simpler? James would gently remind his mother that we had chosen the name for a reason, and I appreciated his support. But Patricia would just smile that tight smile of hers and say, "Of course, dear. It's your choice. I'm just thinking of the child." Despite the tension, those early weeks were also filled with beautiful moments. James would come home from work and immediately take Aurelia, walking her around the house while telling her about his day. He'd sing off-key lullabies that made me laugh through my exhaustion. We'd take turns feeding her in the middle of the night, sometimes just sitting together in comfortable silence as she nursed, marveling at what we had created. One night, after a particularly rough day where Aurelia had been fussy and I was at my wit's end, James pulled me into his arms and whispered, "You're an amazing mother. Aurelia is so lucky to have you." In that moment, all the doubts that had been creeping in, amplified by Patricia's subtle criticisms, seemed to fade away. As the weeks went by, Patricia's help began to feel more like a takeover. She started answering when people called to check on the baby. She'd schedule visits with her friends to show off her granddaughter without checking with us first. And she never, ever called Aurelia by her full name. "This is my sweet little Rosie," she'd say to her friends who came to visit, completely ignoring the first name we'd chosen. When I gently corrected her, saying, "Her name is Aurelia Rose," Patricia would wave her hand dismissively. "Rose is so much prettier, don't you think? And it honors my side of the family." The fact that we had chosen both names specifically to honor both families seemed to escape her entirely. By the time Aurelia was 6 weeks old, I was starting to get my confidence back. The fog of newborn exhaustion was lifting a bit, and I was becoming more comfortable in my new role as a mother. One afternoon, while Patricia was taking one of her necessary naps, I was folding laundry in the nursery while Aurelia slept. James called to check in, and I found myself whispering not to wake the baby, or his mother. "I think it's time for your mom to go home," I said quietly. "I appreciate her help, but I need to figure out my own routine with Aurelia." James sighed. "I know. She means well, but it's getting to be too much. I'll talk to her tonight." That evening, James gently suggested to Patricia that we needed to establish our own family routine. To my surprise, she didn't put up much resistance. "Of course, darling. I was thinking the same thing. You three need time to bond as a family." She patted his cheek. "But I'll just come by every day to help for a few hours. No need to thank me." It wasn't exactly what we had in mind, but it seemed like progress. The next morning, Patricia arrived promptly at 9 a.m. with grocery bags and a new outfit for Aurelia. A onesie with Rosie embroidered across the front. "Isn't it darling? My friend Martha makes these custom pieces. I ordered 5 more in different colors." I felt my jaw tighten but forced a smile. "That's very thoughtful, Patricia, but as we've mentioned, we call her Aurelia." Patricia busied herself putting away groceries. "Oh, everyone at church already knows her as Rosie. It just flows off the tongue so much better." "Everyone at church?" I exchanged a look with James, who stepped in. "Mom, we appreciate the gift, but we named our daughter Aurelia Rose, and that's what we'll be calling her." Patricia's face fell into that wounded expression I'd come to recognize all too well. "I'm just trying to help. That name is such a burden for a little one. Children can be so cruel about unusual names." The conversation ended there, but the tension lingered. Over the next few weeks, Patricia continued her daily visits, each time bringing some new item labeled Rosie, or telling us about someone else she'd told about her precious little Rose. I tried to focus on the positives. Aurelia was thriving, gaining weight and starting to show more personality each day. James was an incredible father, and our bond felt stronger than ever as we navigated parenthood together. But Patricia's constant presence and undermining cast a shadow over what should have been purely joyful times. If I had known then what was coming, how far Patricia would go to get her way, maybe I would have put my foot down harder. Maybe I would have banned her from our home until she could respect our boundaries. But hindsight is always clearer than the fog of new parenthood. And Patricia, with her helpful smiles and her insistence that she only wanted what was best for the baby, was about to cross a line that would change our family forever. By the time Aurelia was 3 months old, we had settled into something resembling a routine. Patricia was still coming over almost daily, but I had learned to schedule appointments and errands during her visits to limit our interaction. It wasn't ideal, but it was manageable. Until that Tuesday afternoon in April. I remember it perfectly because it was the first truly warm day after a long winter. I had opened all the windows to let in the fresh spring air. Patricia was watching Aurelia while I caught up on some work emails. I heard my daughter start to fuss, then Patricia's voice cooing to her. There, Rosie. Grandma's got you." I sighed and kept typing. This battle felt endless and exhausting. When Aurelia fell asleep, Patricia announced she was going to run to the pharmacy to pick up her prescription. She asked if I needed anything, and I requested some more baby wipes. As she gathered her things, her oversized purse tipped over on the coffee table, spilling its contents across the surface. "Let me help," I said, kneeling down to gather lipsticks, tissues, and store receipts. That's when I saw it, a folded document that had slid partially under the couch. I pulled it out, thinking it was just another receipt, but the official letterhead caught my eye. It was a copy of a birth certificate application. For a moment, I was confused. Why would Patricia have... Then I saw my daughter's date of birth, and the name Field, Rose Patricia Wilson. My heart stopped. Rose Patricia, not Aurelia Rose. And Patricia as the middle name, not Rose. My hands started shaking. I looked up to find Patricia staring at me, her expression unreadable. "What is this?" My voice came out as a whisper. Patricia straightened her shoulders. "You shouldn't go through other people's belongings. This is my daughter's birth certificate, except it's not her name." The shock was giving way to anger now. "What have you done, Patricia?" She snatched the paper from my hands. "I did what was best for the child. That ridiculous name would have followed her for life." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "You changed my baby's name without our permission? How is that even possible?" Patricia's chin lifted defiantly. "James gave me the hospital paperwork to drop off. He was so tired, poor boy, running between you and the baby. I simply corrected the form before submitting it." The room seemed to tilt around me. "You forged our signatures? That's illegal." "Don't be dramatic. I simply helped James with the paperwork, like any good mother would. Rose is a family name, my mother's name. It's proper, traditional, something she won't be embarrassed by when she's older." I grabbed my phone. "I'm calling James." 20 excruciating minutes later, James burst through the door, his face pale with shock. I had never seen him so angry. "Mom, tell me this isn't true. Tell me you didn't change Aurelia's name on her birth certificate." Patricia had composed herself during the wait. "James, you weren't thinking clearly in those early days. I did you a favor. Rose Patricia is a beautiful name that honors our family legacy." "Her name is Aurelia Rose," James said through gritted teeth. "We chose it together. We filled out the paperwork together." "Well, legally, her name is Rose now," Patricia said with a finality that made my blood boil. "And that's for the best. Your coworker Susan told me her cousin named her daughter something unusual, and that poor child gets teased mercilessly." I watched James carefully. For a terrible moment, I saw hesitation cross his face. Was he actually considering his mother's reasoning? "James?" My voice cracked. He shook his head as if clearing it. "This is unacceptable, Mom. You had no right." Patricia's expression hardened. I had every right as her grandmother to protect her from a lifetime of having to spell and pronounce an absurd name. "You'll thank me later." "Get out!" The words came from me, surprising even myself with their force. "Get out of our house. Now." Patricia turned to James, clearly expecting him to contradict me. When he didn't, her eyes widened in disbelief. "You can't be serious. After everything I've done for you, for that baby?" "We'll discuss this later, Mom," James said, his voice tight. "But right now, I think it's best if you go." After Patricia left, the silence in our house was deafening. James sat at the kitchen table, head in his hands. I paced, anger and betrayal coursing through me. "We need to fix this," I finally said. "We need to correct her birth certificate." "I know," James sighed. "I'll call the records office tomorrow." But fixing Patricia's deception proved far more complicated than we anticipated. The next day, James spent hours on the phone, being transferred from one department to another. We learned we would need to file a formal petition for a name change with the court, provide documentation, pay fees, and possibly even appear before a judge, all because Patricia had taken it upon herself to correct our daughter's name. "This is going to take months," James said that evening, his voice heavy with frustration. "And until it's resolved, all her official documents, her social security card, medical records, everything, they all say Rose Patricia." I felt sick to my stomach. How could she do this to us? To Aurelia? The look of guilt on James's face made my heart sink. I should never have given her those papers. I was so exhausted, and she offered to drop them off. He trailed off, rubbing his forehead. Part of me wanted to blame him, but I knew that wasn't fair. We had both been vulnerable, sleep-deprived, trusting that his mother would respect our wishes. We never imagined she would go this far. The next few days were a blur of paperwork, phone calls, and legal research. We learned we'd need a lawyer to expedite the process, adding expense to the already mounting stress. All the while, Aurelia, sweet, innocent Aurelia, remained blissfully unaware of the chaos her grandmother had created. Patricia called repeatedly, leaving voicemails that ranged from defensive to tearfully apologetic. "I only wanted what was best," she'd say. "The family name should be carried on properly." Or, "I don't understand why you're so upset. Rose is a beautiful name. More beautiful than that foreign-sounding one you chose." A week after our discovery, Patricia showed up unannounced at our door with a peace offering. A handmade quilt with Rose Patricia embroidered in its center. James answered the door. I stood behind him, holding Aurelia close to my chest. "I thought we could talk this through," Patricia said, her voice honey-sweet. "Families shouldn't be divided like this. Look what I made for little Rosie." She held up the quilt, and something in me snapped. "Her name," I said, my voice shaking, "is Aurelia Rose. And until you can accept that, until you can admit what you did was wrong, you are not welcome in this house. Or in her life." Patricia's face crumpled, then hardened. "You're overreacting. James, tell her she's overreacting." But James stood firm. "No, Mom. What you did was a violation of our trust and possibly illegal. We're working to fix it now, but you need to understand, this isn't your decision to make." As we closed the door on Patricia's protests, I felt a strange mix of vindication and dread. This battle was far from over. We had underestimated how far Patricia would go once before. I couldn't help but wonder what she would do next. 2 weeks passed without contact from Patricia. I hoped foolishly that perhaps she had finally understood the gravity of what she'd done. Maybe she was taking this time to reflect, to realize that she had crossed an unforgivable line. I should have known better. The first sign that Patricia hadn't backed down came from James's cousin Heather, who called to check in on little Rose. When I corrected her, there was an awkward pause. "That's strange," Heather said. "Aunt Patricia sent out birth announcements last week with the name Rose Patricia. She even included a little note saying you'd had a change of heart about the original name." My hand gripped the phone so tightly my knuckles turned white. She did what? By the end of the day, I'd received 3 more calls from extended family members, all confused about our daughter's name. James called his mother immediately, putting her on speakerphone in our kitchen. "Mom, did you send out birth announcements for Aurelia?" "Of course I did," Patricia answered brightly. "Every Wilson grandbaby gets a proper announcement. It's tradition." "With the wrong name," James said flatly. Patricia sighed dramatically. "James, we've been through this. Rose Patricia is her legal name." "Only because you forged our documents," I couldn't help interjecting. "I simplified the paperwork," Patricia countered. "And honestly, it's been months now. Everyone knows her as Rose. It would be confusing to change it at this point. James put his hand on my arm, feeling my tension. Mom, we're in the middle of legally changing her name back to what we intended. What you did was wrong, and sending out those announcements is only making things more difficult. I'm only thinking of the child, Patricia insisted. And your father agrees with me. This was a new tactic. Patricia often invoked her husband David, who generally stayed out of family conflicts. Dad said that? James asked, his voice tinged with doubt. Of course he did. He told me, Patricia, that baby needs a sensible name, not some made-up nonsense. So, I watched James's face fall, and it broke my heart. He had always looked up to his father, a quiet, reasonable man. The thought that he might be taking Patricia's side clearly hurt. Later that night, after calling his father directly and learning that David had said no such thing, James sat at our kitchen table looking defeated. I don't recognize my mother anymore, he admitted. She's lying, manipulating, hurting people she claims to love. I don't understand it. I wanted to comfort him, but I was fighting my own anger. Our lawyer had informed us that the name change process would take another 6 to 8 weeks. Every day that passed meant more people knew our daughter by the wrong name. More documents generated with Rose Patricia on them. More complications to untangle. The next morning, Patricia texted us both. I've scheduled Rose's baptism for next month. Pastor Jim is so excited to meet her. Attached was an image of a custom-made baptism gown with Rose Patricia Wilson, embroidered along the hem. James called her immediately. I could hear Patricia's voice through the phone, defensive and shrill. We are her grandparents. We have rights too. If you won't have her properly christened, we will. Mom, you have no legal right to schedule a baptism for our child without our permission, James said, his voice strained but controlled. And her name is Aurelia. This is her influence, isn't it? Patricia's voice dripped with accusation. She's turned you against your own family, against tradition. I watched James close his eyes, gather his patience. This has nothing to do with anyone turning me. This is about you overstepping and not respecting our decisions as Aurelia's parents. The conversation ended with Patricia in tears, accusing James of breaking her heart. After hanging up, he looked at me with such weariness that I felt a pang of guilt. I'm sorry, I said. I know this is harder on you. She's your mother. James shook his head. Don't apologize. You've done nothing wrong. He crossed the room and pulled me into his arms. We're a team. Your family is my priority now. You and Aurelia. His words should have reassured me, but I could feel the strain this was putting on our marriage. The constant stress, the legal complications, the family drama, it was all taking a toll. There were moments when I caught James looking pensive, and I wondered if part of him wished we'd just give in to make peace. Patricia's campaign continued on multiple fronts. She contacted our pediatrician's office to update them on the baby's legal name. She sent monogrammed items to our house at least weekly. Blankets, clothes, a piggy bank, all bearing the name Rose Patricia. She rallied family members to call and express concern about our stubbornness and how it was creating division in the family. Each new boundary violation felt like another brick on my chest, making it harder to breathe, harder to enjoy the precious early months with my daughter. 3 months after discovering the birth certificate deception, we agreed to meet Patricia and David at a neutral location, a quiet cafe, to try to resolve things. Our lawyer had advised documenting all interactions, so I had my phone recording in my pocket as we sat down at a corner table. Patricia had arrived armed with a photo album. I've been keeping this for Rose, she announced, sliding it across the table. Her first memory book. I opened it to find dozens of carefully arranged photographs, with Rose Patricia Wilson written in calligraphy on the first page. Each milestone, Rose's first smile, Rose holds her bottle, Rose's first Easter, was meticulously documented. It struck me then that in Patricia's mind, Aurelia Rose didn't exist. She had created an entirely different grandchild. "Mom," James began gently, "we appreciate the effort, but this isn't helping. The court date for the name change is next month. Her name will legally be Aurelia Rose, as we intended." Patricia's smile remained fixed, but her eyes hardened. "You really want to put that poor child through life with people mispronouncing and misspelling her name? For what? To be unique, special. She'll resent you for it." "That's enough," David finally spoke up. "Patricia, we've discussed this. It's their child, their choice." I felt a surge of gratitude toward my father-in-law, but it was short-lived. Patricia turned on him. "So you're against me too?" After I explained how important it is to maintain the family name. "My mother's name?" "Your mother, who you barely spoke to in the last 10 years of her life?" David asked quietly. The question hung in the air. I hadn't known this about Patricia's relationship with her mother. "That's completely irrelevant," Patricia snapped. She turned back to us. "I've already told everyone in our church and social circle about Rose. Do you know how humiliating it would be to correct them all now? About as humiliating as discovering your mother-in-law forged legal documents to rename your child?" I suggested. Patricia's face flushed. "I did what had to be done because you two were too inexperienced to make the right decision." That's when James stood up. "We're done here. Mom, until you can respect that we are Aurelia's parents and we make decisions for her, we need to take a step back from this relationship." Patricia's mouth fell open. "You can't keep my granddaughter from me. I have rights." "Actually," I said, gathering our things, "you don't. And right now, you've lost the privilege of being in her life." As we walked out, Patricia called after us, "This isn't over." A child needs her grandmother. In the car, I finally broke down in tears. Will this ever end? Will she ever stop? James took my hand. "I don't know, but we'll protect Aurelia, whatever it takes." What we didn't realize then was that Patricia had been backed into a corner, and like any wounded animal, she was about to lash out in ways we couldn't have anticipated. Sometimes the most significant revelations come from the most unexpected places. For me, it was a dusty box in my father-in-law's attic. 2 weeks after our disastrous cafe meeting, David called James. "Son, I think you should come by the house when your mother's at her book club. There's something you need to see." I decided to join James, bringing Aurelia with us. David had always been kind to me, but typically stayed on the sidelines of family conflicts. His reaching out like this was unusual. When we arrived, David led us upstairs to the attic. "I've been thinking about this situation with your mother," he said, pulling a string to light a single bulb. "Her obsession with names. It's not new." He pointed to a stack of boxes labeled Patricia Personal. "She doesn't know I kept these. After we married, she wanted to throw them all away." James looked confused. "What are they?" "Your mother's past," David said simply. "Before she became Patricia Wilson, society maven and perfect grandmother." With David's permission, we opened the first box. Inside were yearbooks, photos, and documents from before Patricia and David met. I pulled out a high school yearbook from 1975 and flipped through until I found her class photo. I nearly dropped the book. "Bertha Gertrude Higgins?" I read aloud. David nodded. "Everyone called her Gertie. She hated it. The day she turned 18, she legally changed her name to Patricia Grace. Reinvented herself completely." James stared at his father. Mom's real name is Bertha? She changed her own name but has the audacity to criticize our choice? Hypocrisy has never been a barrier for your mother, David said with a sad smile. Look deeper. We found old letters addressed to Bertha, class photos with Gertie scribbled beneath her image, even her original birth certificate. Most revealing was a diary from her senior year, filled with entries about how much she hated her name, how it made her feel ugly and old-fashioned, how she planned to become someone else entirely once she escaped her small town. She spent 50 years burying Bertha Gertrude, David explained. Created this whole persona as Patricia Wilson. Even her closest friends don't know. I felt a strange mix of emotions. Vindication that we'd discovered her secret, but also a new understanding of Patricia's fixation on our daughter's name. Names held power for her. They represented identity, acceptance, the person you present to the world. What are you going to do with this information? David asked quietly. James and I exchanged looks. Nothing vindictive, James finally said. But maybe this is the key to making her understand. The court date for Aurelia's name change arrived. Despite our explicit request that she not attend, Patricia showed up in a conservative dress, ready to plead her case to the judge. Her face fell when she realized the matter was largely administrative. The judge reviewed our documentation, confirmed that we were correcting a submission error, we decided against pursuing fraud charges, and approved the change with minimal discussion. Aurelia Rose Wilson was now her legal official name. As we left the courthouse, Patricia hurried after us. This isn't fair to the child, she insisted. She's been Rose for nearly 6 months now. Mom, James said firmly, it's done. If you want to be part of Aurelia's life, you need to accept her name and respect our decisions as her parents. Patricia's lips thinned to a tight line. We'll see, she said before walking away. The next few weeks were blissfully quiet. No gifts with the wrong name, no family members calling with confusion. I began to hope that perhaps Patricia had finally accepted reality. Then came the invitation, Patricia and David's 35th wedding anniversary celebration. A formal dinner at their country club, family and friends invited. The card was addressed to James, Sarah, and baby Aurelia. She used her actual name, I said, showing James. Is this progress? James looked skeptical. Maybe. Or a new tactic. We debated whether to attend, ultimately deciding it would be a gesture of goodwill. Perhaps this was Patricia's way of extending an olive branch. While preparing for the event, I couldn't stop thinking about Bertha Gertrude Higgins and her transformation into Patricia Grace Wilson. An idea began to form. Not malicious, but perhaps enlightening. A way to help Patricia understand what she had tried to do to our daughter. James, I said carefully, what if we gave your mother a very special anniversary gift? The day of the party arrived. The country club ballroom was elegant, with floral centerpieces and champagne flowing freely. Patricia, resplendent in a designer dress, greeted guests at the door while David stood faithfully by her side. When she saw us with Aurelia, her smile tightened almost imperceptibly. There's my beautiful granddaughter, she cooed, reaching for the baby. I noted she avoided using any name at all. Not Aurelia, not Rose. A small compromise, at least. The evening progressed pleasantly enough. Dinner was served, toasts were made. Then came time for gifts. We had positioned ours to be opened last. A large, beautifully wrapped box with a card addressed to David and Bertha Gertrude. Patricia's face froze when she read the envelope. Her eyes darted around the room, confirming that others had seen it too. There must be a mistake, she said with a forced laugh. No mistake, James said pleasantly. Go ahead, open it, Mom. With trembling hands, Patricia unwrapped the package. Inside was a handcrafted family tree, beautifully illustrated and framed. At the top were David Wilson and Bertha Gertrude Higgins, aka Patricia Grace Wilson. Below them was James, then Aurelia Rose Wilson, with her birth date. "What is the meaning of this?" Patricia hissed. "It's your family history, Mom," James said, loud enough for nearby guests to hear. "We thought it was important for Aurelia to know her grandmother's real name and story. How you were born, Bertha Gertrude, but changed your name because it didn't suit you. How you reinvented yourself as Patricia." The murmurs around the room grew as Patricia's friends exchanged surprised glances. "Your name is Bertha?" her closest friend asked incredulously. Patricia's face had turned an alarming shade of red. This is utterly inappropriate," she sputtered. I stepped forward then, keeping my voice gentle. "We thought you, of all people, would understand the importance of being called by your true name, the name your parents chose for you, just as we chose Aurelia Rose for our daughter." The room had gone silent. David placed a supportive hand on Patricia's back, but I could see the slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "You had no right," Patricia whispered. "No," I agreed. "Just as you had no right to change Aurelia's name. The difference is we're not forcing you to go back to being Bertha. We're simply acknowledging that it's part of who you are." Patricia stood abruptly, nearly knocking over her chair, and fled the room. David sighed, but didn't follow her. "Was that too much?" I asked him quietly. He shook his head. "Perhaps it needed to happen. Patricia has spent a lifetime running from her past, controlling everything and everyone around her. Maybe now she'll understand what it feels like when someone else tries to rewrite your story." The aftermath was predictably dramatic. Patricia refused to speak to us for weeks. But slowly, something shifted. A package arrived at our door. The baby memory book she had created, now with Aurelia Rose Wilson carefully written over the previous name. No note, no explanation. 2 weeks later, David called. "She'd like to see the baby," he said. "On your terms." When Patricia finally visited, she was subdued, less confident than I'd ever seen her. When she held Aurelia, she whispered, "Hello, sweet Aurelia." It wasn't an apology, but it was acknowledgement. Later, as she was leaving, she paused by the door. "The family tree," she said stiffly. "It's actually quite beautiful workmanship. Perhaps we could hang it in our home." It wasn't forgiveness, exactly. The road to rebuilding trust would be long. But it was a beginning, an understanding that names matter, that identity is personal, that boundaries must be respected. And sometimes the most effective way to teach someone a lesson is to give them a taste of their own medicine. Or in this case, a name they'll never forget.